In his memoir, The Last Time I Wore a Dress, Dylan Chelinski describes being institutionalized in a psychiatric hospital at the age of 15 because he was diagnosed as an inappropriate female. Doctors pathologized Chelinski because of his masculine gender performance when he had been assigned female at birth and given a girl's name. Chelinski stayed in the psychiatric hospital until he was 18, at which point he was released only because his medical insurance ran out. During these 3 years in a psychiatric hospital, Chelinski was subjected to what he describes as extreme femininity training. Afterwards, in his memoir, he would write, "I still wonder why I wasn't treated for my depression, why no one noticed that I'd been sexually abused, why the doctors didn't seem to believe that I came from a home with physical violence, why the thing they cared the most about was whether I acted the part of a feminine young lady. The shame is that the effects of depression, sexual abuse, violence, all treatable, but where I stood on the feminine-masculine scale, unchangeable. It's who I am." Close quote. Chelinski does not deny that he had mental health issues as a teenager, or that these mental health issues might have been treated at the hospital to which he was committed. However, he notes that these mental health issues were not recognized by doctors as the psychological impacts of being a survivor of both sexual and physical abuse. Instead, the doctors fixated on his gender performance. Chelinski's problems were thus individualized. His gender was seen as the problem, and it was his gender that the doctor sought to cure. Chelinski, however, insists that the problem lay not with his gender, but with the abuse he had experienced in his family, the oppression that he had experienced in a transphobic society, and the impacts that these had had on him. As he observes, these impacts were treatable, whereas his gender was not. Despite years of extreme femininity training, Chelinski would stop wearing dresses when released from the hospital and would eventually transition to living as a man. The Mad Pride movement argues that instead of being pathologized, mental differences should be respected, appreciated, and affirmed, and in many cases, they should also be recognized as sociogenic, or originating in society rather than in the individual. The Mad Pride movement is similar to, and some would say that it is a part of, the disability rights movement. These similarities include the facts that, 1. Both movements insist on better medical treatment and patient autonomy, and in some cases they resist medicalization altogether. Both movements want more patient input into treatment plans, and both take up the slogans, "Nothing about us without us," and "No forced treatment ever." MAD activists often describe themselves as psychiatric consumers, psychiatric survivors, or ex-patients of psychiatry. The former group, those identifying as consumers, is more likely to be demanding greater autonomy or to be seen as customers or clients rather than patients when it comes to their psychiatric treatment. The latter groups, those identifying as survivors or ex-patients of psychiatry, are more likely to be resisting psychiatric treatment wholesale. 2. Both disability rights and Mad Pride movements share a resistance to the biomedical assignment of impairment. 3. Both movements strive to reduce individualization, medicalization, and segregation. We saw this earlier in the class with respect to the disability movement's rejection of individual models of disability in favor of social models of disability. For the Mad Pride movement, the problems that get diagnosed as mental illness in individuals are often better located in families, communities, and societies, as in Chelinski's case. 4. Both movements resist medical and social pronouncements of inferiority or negative ontologies, whether of disability or madness. They argue that it is okay and even good to be different, whether mentally or physically. Who wants a society of normmates? Indeed, few of us are normmates. Most of us differ from the norm in some way or another, whether because we have a physical or cognitive disability, are diagnosed with a mental health condition, or because we're queer or fat or not white, or we speak with an accent or a stutter. The norm is not a statistical phenomenon, it is ideological. Both disability and MAD movements thus critique the idealization of normality and the power of norms. 5. Both movements critique stereotypes and representations of disability and madness. 6. And finally, while disability activists critique ableism, mad pride activists critique mentalism or sanism. Thus, although people diagnosed with physical disabilities, cognitive disabilities, and mental illness have different histories and experiences, they also have many commonalities and can form a powerful coalition. The history of resistance to the medicalization of madness might be dated to 1886, when Elizabeth Ware Packard founded the Anti-Insane Asylum Society in the United States and began publishing books and pamphlets critical of psychiatry. The history of resistance to psychiatry intersects with feminist history, as Packard also challenged the subordination of women to their husbands and the complicity of the political and psychiatric establishments to this subordination. Packard had been abducted and committed to an insane asylum by her husband in 1860 when she, quote, refused to play the role of obedient minister's wife, close quote, and expressed religious views that differed from those of her husband and religious congregation. Packard obtained her freedom after 3 years of incarceration when she went to court and was declared sane. She then began a 20-year campaign for personal liberty laws to protect women from wrongful commitment and retention in asylums. She wrote the 1868 book Modern Persecution, or Insane Asylums Unveiled, in which she argued that there was no medical treatment in asylums, there was simply violence. Despite its roots in the 19th century, the anti-psychiatry movement grew exponentially in the 1970s. At this time, anti-psychiatry activists, including prominent intellectuals such as the French philosopher Michel Foucault and the renegade psychiatrist Thomas Szasz, protested the despotism and abuses of the psychiatric profession and coerced institutionalization. Like Packard, they argued that the psychiatric system was not healthcare, but was rather characterized by disrespect and violence, in which so-called patients were entirely excluded from treatment planning. Foucault and Szasz both raise epistemological critiques of psychiatry. In his first major work, History of Madness, published in 1961, Foucault questioned what we really know about madness and whether it is best understood as illness at all. As he shows, madness has been understood in various other ways over the course of human history. The medicalization of madness is but its most recent and not necessarily its most compelling interpretation. The use of the term mad instead of mentally ill in Mad Pride and Mad Studies builds on Foucault's insight, refusing to concede that the mad are ill or that madness is a health concern at all. Foucault, who by the 1970s was the most famous philosopher of his day, would go on critiquing psychiatry and the sciences more generally throughout his career, notably in works from the 1970s such as Abnormal, Psychiatric Power, and the History of Sexuality. For his part, Thomas Szasz was a dissident psychiatrist who, from the late 1950s onward, wrote 25 books arguing that mental illness is a myth and there should be complete separation between psychiatry and the state. As he wrote, quote, involuntary mental hospitalization is imprisonment under the guise of treatment. It is a covert form of social control that subverts the rule of law. No one ought to be deprived of liberty except for a criminal offense after a trial by jury guided by legal rules of evidence. No one ought to be detained against their will in a building called hospital or any other medical institution on the basis of expert opinion, close quote. In 1961, Szasz testified before a United States Senate committee against the use of psychiatric hospitals as sites of incarceration, where the doctor-patient relationship was transformed into a relationship between warden and prisoner. Numerous anti-psychiatry organizations were founded in North America at around this time, including the Insane Liberation Front in 1970, the Mental Patients Liberation Project in 1971, and the Network Against Psychiatric Assault in 1972. These groups built support programs, advocated for changes in the laws, educated the public through guest lectures and newsletters, began developing alternative, creative, and artistic ways of dealing with emotional suffering and psychological difference outside the medical model of psychiatry. In 1962, Ken Casey published the novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was a damning portrayal of psychiatric asylums. In 1975, a popular film based on the novel was released starring Jack Nicholson, and it would go on to win all 5 major Academy Awards: Best Picture, Best Leading Actor, Best Leading Actress, Best Screenplay, and Best Director, drawing considerable attention to the issue of psychiatric abuse. Another work that educated the public about anti-psychiatric perspectives around the same time was Judy Chamberlain's 1977 book, On Our Own, a mainstream press book exposing psychiatric abuse and exploring consumer-run alternatives. Nearly 50 years later, much has changed. The vast majority of the psychiatric asylums of the 19th and early to mid-20th centuries have been closed, and the psychiatric inpatient population has nearly vanished. The so-called deinstitutionalization of the insane was, however, as much the result of financial cuts and new drugs as it was the result of anti-psychiatry activism, and many scholars have observed that it was less of a deinstitutionalization than it was a change in institution. Today, far more people with mental health problems are incarcerated in prisons than in hospitals, including psychiatric units of prisons. So-called correctional institutions are sometimes called the new asylums, with the 3 largest jails in the U.S. each holding more inmates with psychiatric diagnoses than any psychiatric hospital. The situation is exacerbated by the fact that prisons and practices common to prisons, such as the housing of inmates in isolation units, cause mental health problems. And so, with the closure of asylums, the oppression of the mad did not so much end or even diminish as change form. Part 2 of this lecture will pick up on this history from the 1980s onward.